Fort Worth, Texas. The year was 2001, but the streets still looked like the late 90s never-ended chain restaurants by the highway, dive bars packed on Friday nights, downtown flickering with neon, and neighborhoods split clean by race and income. You could drive 10 minutes from the stockyards and land right in the lap of poverty. This was a city that knew how to look away. I came to the story years later, digging through a case that had already been tried, headlines already faded. But something didn't sit right. Not just what happened, but how long it took for anyone to care. And maybe more disturbing, how close the whole thing came to disappearing completely. The victim, Gregory Biggs, was homeless. That's the first thing most people heard. Like it was a footnote. Like that detail alone explained why no one called the cops. But it didn't explain anything. The man had a name. He had a son. He had been a Mason before mental illness and bad luck dragged him down. When I tracked down one of his old coworkers, he told me he was trying to get back on his feet. Trying, but this city doesn't hand out second chances easily. Then there was Shantae Mallard, 25 years old, African-American, a nursing assistant with plans for more. Not exactly someone who shows up in headlines for all the wrong reasons. But that's exactly what happened after one night in October that spiraled into something no one could have scripted. It started, like a lot of bad nights do, with a party. Shantae had clocked out of her shift at the nursing home. She met up with some friends. There was weed. There was ecstasy. There was alcohol. How much, we may never know for sure. I tried to piece together the hours before it all fell apart, interviewing a former roommate, scrolling through police interviews, even standing outside the address where the party once was, now a used car lot. One woman, who asked not to be named, told me she wasn't acting crazy or anything. Just lit. Like everyone else. Around midnight, Shantae got in her car, a gold Chevrolet Cavalier. She was alone. That's the first moment that matters. She pulled away from the curb, headlight flickering. The party still echoed behind her, music thumping into the night air. She headed south on Riverside Drive. She wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, but she wasn't sober. Not by a long shot. Gregory Biggs was walking along the shoulder. Maybe trying to find a place to sleep. Maybe just lost in thought. What happened next wasn't a mystery, it was physics. Steel against flesh. A split-second decision. And then another. But the real story didn't begin with the crash. It began with what she did after. Because instead of stopping, instead of calling for help, Shantae Mallard kept driving. And Gregory Biggs didn't bounce off the hood. He went through the windshield. The moment of impact didn't sound like it does in the movies. It was blunt. Short. No screech of brakes. Just the thud of a human body hitting glass at 35 miles per hour. I spoke with the officer who first reviewed the scene, years later, off the record. He said it was one of the most surreal case files he'd ever opened. The windshield stayed mostly intact, he told me, except for the hole where his body came in. Gregory Biggs had gone partially through, legs still outside, torso folded into the cabin. But he was alive, bleeding, in shock, and conscious enough to moan. The blood pooled fast. Not just from head wounds, but from a compound fracture in his thigh, the kind that, untreated, becomes fatal within hours. Here's where things should have taken a different path. Shantae Mallard had training in patient care. She'd worked night shifts, changed dressings, calmed dementia patients during panic episodes. She knew the basics of trauma response. More importantly, she had a cell phone. She could have called 911. She could have pulled over and flagged someone down. She didn't. Instead, she drove home. I traced her route from Riverside Drive back to her house, a modest one-story brick home near the freeway. A neighborhood where porch lights stay on at night, not because people are friendly, but because they're afraid. No one saw her pull into the driveway. Or if they did, they never said. She opened the garage, parked the Cavalier, shut the engine off. Then she left the car running, metaphorically speaking, because Gregory Biggs was still inside, impaled in the windshield, bleeding, semi-conscious, barely able to speak. And she went inside. That's the part one couldn't shake. Not the crash, not the blood, but the sheer normalcy of what came next. She changed clothes, poured herself a drink, took a shower, possibly fell asleep. The timeline's fuzzy. But what's not in dispute is this. Biggs didn't die instantly. He died over the next 2 to 3 days. In her garage. And she knew he was there. At one point, she checked on him. Stood there, looking at his half-broken body slumped in the glass. She told investigators she didn't know what to do. She panicked. Froze. Thought she'd go to prison. Thought no one would believe it was an accident. Maybe all of that is true, but none of it changes what happened. It's important to pause here and say, this wasn't a psychopath. Mallard didn't have a history of violence. She wasn't a serial liar or manipulator. By most accounts, she was kind, polite, even smart. Which is why the horror of her inaction lands so hard. This wasn't evil in the cinematic sense. It was something colder, smaller. The kind of evil that grows in silence. The kind that whispers, just pretend it didn't happen. But Gregory Biggs was still moaning. Still there. Still dying. And the clock was ticking. The garage was a box of silence. Concrete floor. Thin drywall. No insulation. No windows. Just one bare bulb and the gold Cavalier with its shattered windshield. I went there years later, after the house had changed owners. They let me into the garage. I stood in the spot where Gregory Biggs died. The walls had been repainted. The floor scrubbed clean. But if you listened hard enough, you could still feel it. That terrible stillness. That quiet no one dared to break. The official autopsy stated he likely died of blood loss, dehydration, and shock. Not instantly. Not quickly. Which means, had someone called for help, even hours later, he might have lived. Might have lost a leg. Might have been in pain for weeks. But he'd have survived. Instead, Shantae Mallard kept the garage door shut. She told police later that she was too scared to ask for help. That she thought she'd go to jail. That she didn't want anyone to know. But fear doesn't last 48 hours. What does last is detachment. I interviewed a psychologist for this case. She described it as moral paralysis, when someone is so overwhelmed by the consequences of their own actions that they convince themselves the best course is no action at all. It's not insanity. It's denial turned weapon. Shantae visited the garage more than once. She heard him. He was crying, begging, moaning. According to her own testimony, she spoke to him, said she was sorry, that she didn't mean it, but she didn't open the door, didn't get a towel, didn't call anyone. In her words, I was hoping it would just go away. So she lived her life. She watched TV, ate meals, took a phone call from her mother. She probably passed the garage door a dozen times. Every time, Gregory Biggs was still there, dying slower than most of us would ever imagine possible. I found records of a neighbor who noticed the car hadn't moved for days. They never thought to ask. Why would they? It's just a parked car. Just a closed garage. Just another forgettable corner of suburban Texas. When I read the forensics report, it stopped me cold. Biggs had torn a few of his own fingernails, likely from trying to pull himself free. The windshield glass was smeared with blood. His head injuries were severe, but he was not unconscious the entire time. In his final hours, his body went into shock. Then dehydration set in. And finally, stillness. Shantae found him lifeless sometime the second or third night. She didn't scream. She didn't fall to her knees. Instead, she waited another day before reaching out. When Shantae Mallard finally picked up the phone, she didn't dial 911. She called Cletus Jackson, someone she knew from the neighborhood. Not a close friend. Not someone from work. Just a name she thought might not ask too many questions. What exactly she said on that first call, we'll never know. But court records confirmed the outcome. Cletus agreed to help. And he didn't come alone. He brought his cousin, Herbert Tyrone Cleveland. They met at Shantae's house under cover of night. I found the police photos from that week, the Cavalier still in the garage, windshield still broken, blood still visible. The interior reeked of decay. Jackson later admitted to investigators that he gagged the moment he saw Biggs's body. But he didn't walk away. Instead, the three of them set to work. They wrapped Gregory Biggs in a sheet and lifted him from the windshield. That took time. The glass had locked his body into the frame like a grotesque sculpture. There were cuts, bloodstains, torn fabric. None of it seemed to slow them down. They loaded him into the trunk of another car. According to testimony, they drove through the dark for over 30 minutes before stopping near Cobb Park, a mostly deserted stretch of land on the city's east side. It had once been popular. By 2001, it was mostly used for drug deals and illegal dumping. They pulled the body from the trunk, left it near a chain-link fence. Someone, it's still unclear who, poured lighter fluid onto a part of the Cavalier's upholstery they'd ripped out, then lit a match. They didn't torch the whole car, just enough to make it look like vandalism, like some random joyride gone bad. The fire burned fast and hot, then sputtered out. They left the scene. Back in the neighborhood, Shantae began cleaning. She tossed bloodied clothes, scrubbed the dashboard, tried to vacuum out dried blood, but there was too much of it. She told herself no one would connect her to a dead man found in a park on the other side of town. And for a while, no one did. The next day, a jogger found Biggs's body and called the police. Detectives opened a file. No ID. No witnesses. The cause of death was unclear. Too much time had passed. The police chalked it up to another John Doe case in a city that had plenty. Shantae went on living. She went back to work, smiled at coworkers, went out again with friends. On the outside, nothing changed. But inside that house, and in the minds of everyone involved, something was rotting. I spoke with a former friend of Cleveland's. He told me that after the disposal, Cleveland couldn't sleep for days. He started talking about it in pieces, like nightmares. But he never turned himself in. None of them did. Weeks passed, then months. And still, the secret held. Until one night, at another party, Shantae Mallard opened her mouth, and the whole thing began to unravel. Secrets don't leak, they crack. For nearly 4 months, no one suspected Shantae Mallard. No warrants. No interviews. The cops had nothing, no forensics, no suspect vehicle, no eyewitnesses. Gregory Biggs remained an anonymous corpse in a case file marked pending. Until one night, inside a living room full of smoke and cheap beer, someone said the wrong thing. It was a small house party, friends of friends, mostly. Music played low. Bottles clinked. Someone passed a blunt. Just another night in Southeast Fort Worth. Shantae was there. Relaxed. Laughing. Comfortable in the version of her life she had rebuilt. She'd survived the worst. No one knew. It was over. And that's when she said it. I hit this white guy, she laughed. He went through my windshield. There's no recording. No video. Just the memory of one woman who heard the comment and froze. Her name was Miranda Daniel, and she knew something wasn't right. Not the joke. Not the tone. Not the fact that Shantae smiled when she said it. Daniel didn't go to the police immediately. She let it sit. Thought maybe it was an exaggeration. Maybe just talk. But the more she thought about it, the more it nagged at her. Weeks later, she told a friend. That friend told someone else. And eventually, word reached the Fort Worth PD. When detectives pulled the old file, they were skeptical. The case had been cold for months. A badly decomposed body, no suspect vehicle, no known witnesses. But they followed the tip. They found Shantae Mallard. They asked to look at her car. It wasn't there. She told them it had been stolen, burned. She wasn't sure what happened to it. Just vague answers and nervous deflections. But something about her story didn't fit. The more they dug, the stranger it seemed. The real break came when police searched her home and discovered small traces of blood still lodged in the garage floor. A few fibers in a vacuum cleaner bag. A piece of shattered windshield behind a storage shelf. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Then they questioned Cletus Jackson. He cracked. Fast. Told them everything, the garage, the drive, the dump site. He gave up Cleveland too. By the end of the week, all three were in custody. I read the interview transcripts. Mallard sobbed. Said she didn't mean to kill him. That she just panicked. That it spiraled. That it was a mistake. Maybe it was. But it wasn't just one. It was 100 moments strung together, all of them chances to do the right thing. And she missed every single one. The courtroom was packed. Not with press. The story had already made its rounds by then. But with people. Regular people. Some there for Gregory Biggs. Some just curious. Some there for the shock of it. The nurse's aide who left a man to die in her garage. Shantae Mallard pled guilty to murder. More specifically, murder through omission. The prosecution argued she had every opportunity to save a man's life and chose not to. They brought in trauma specialists who testified that even basic first aid, pressure, elevation, calling for help, could have kept Biggs alive long enough to be saved. But it wasn't just the crime that haunted the court. It was the silence. The hours. The days. The moment she made a choice, not just to drive home with a body in her windshield, but to carry on as if nothing had happened. Her defense team leaned into fear and shame. Said she panicked. Said she didn't understand how badly he was hurt. Said she was young. That her training was minimal. That trauma overwhelmed her judgment. The jury didn't buy it. They convicted her of murder and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to 50 years. Cletus Jackson and Herbert Cleveland, who helped dispose of the body, received 10 years each for evidence tampering. After the trial, I spoke with one of the paramedics who had worked in the area for decades. He'd seen hundreds of car accidents, dozens of fatalities. When I asked what stuck with him about this case, he didn't hesitate. It wasn't just that she hit him. It was that she watched him die slowly. That's what nobody could wrap their head around. Neither could I. I thought a lot about Gregory Biggs in those last hours. Not just the pain, but the loneliness. The absurdity of dying trapped in a windshield, 30 feet from a working telephone, while the person who could save you folds laundry. There was no public fund in his name. No statue. Just a name in court records and a son, Brandon, who stood quietly at the sentencing, holding a folded photo of his father. And Shantae? She'll be eligible for parole in 2027. She's serving her sentence at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. From what I could gather, she keeps to herself. But I wonder if she ever hears it. The sound of breathing in the dark. The voice that said nothing and then stopped.